Good afternoon and welcome to the video on the 1928 Bremer Tully 771 sliding door console. This was a 3-year restoration involving over 4,000 man hours. It was worth every minute of it. She's a beautiful radio. The music you're hearing through it is being provided by my own AM transmitter, as the only radio station out here is talk only. Now you're going to see a slideshow, and after that I'll be back and we'll play a little more music. But for now we're going to turn it up and listen to this great old radio. This old Bremer Tully was found rotting away in a barn in Canastota, New York, back in the winter of 2008. Had stuff piled on top of it, and the roof was leaking over it. We decided, well, it was in pretty bad shape. The top was all peeled up, and the inside was the wonderful world of corrosion. There were a squirrel or chipmunk nest had been built inside the radio, and spiders and cobwebs everywhere. The man said, well, give me $25 and you can take it home. After some thinking, it's like, well, at least it is all there. We gave him the $25 and brought it home, and after taking a whole bunch of pictures, started coming up with a game plan to restore this beautiful old radio. I knew it was going to be a real challenge. We started with the cabinet first. It had to be entirely chemically stripped, and once we had finished that and all the finish sanding, we turned our attention to that destroyed top which had to be replaced. Well, the base wood was leveled and flattened out again. Then we used some very old black American walnut veneer that I had to re-veneer the top of the cabinet. It's quite the process to get it to look right. Then it was on to the little details, such as the staining that had to be performed on some parts of the cabinet, and the little details like the dots that run across the front. We also had to recreate the missing F-lots that had been broken off the cabinet. They were recreated from pictures we had on a sales flyer. Then the rest of the summer and fall was varnish on, varnish off. As you can see, the top turned out to be a virtual mirror with 23 coats of varnish on it. The rest of the cabinet received the same treatment, both inside and out. And when we were finished, we realized that we had made the right decision in bringing that old radio home for restoration. 40 pounds of black American walnut brought back to life again. The speaker cloth was a project of its own, trying to do the scroll work and get it correct. The replacement cloth came from Radio Days, very closely matches what was originally on the radio. Over 1,000 man hours went into just the cabinet alone, and what a stunning, beautiful piece it is. Next, we started on the speaker. We knew it was going to present some unusual challenges, as the cone was in mint condition, yet the rest of it was destroyed. How to restore it without damaging that cone? Well, it wound up being more time-consuming than anything else, and making sure that nothing happened to that mint condition cone. A lot of the parts and pieces that could be removed were stripped, primed, and repainted so that they would be correct again. The frame itself, with the cone in place, was carefully repainted so that nothing would damage that cone or get on it. And as you can see from the finished pictures, it turned out pretty nice. The cone was in great shape. The speaker once again had the transformer and all the wiring replaced and was working really well. Fortunately, we didn't have to disturb those tuning tongs that it comes with, and it played beautifully once we were finished. With the speaker ready, it was right back into the cabinet and time to get started on the nightmare. Next came the nightmare of the chassis. I'd seen bad before, but this was going to be a real challenge. We started by taking hundreds of pictures of the chassis in its current condition, so that by the time I would get around to putting it back together again, hopefully I would have everything where it belonged. So it was get a tetanus shot and dig in. Some of the corrosion on this and the gunk was probably toxic. It was so bad. You can see the paint missing from the heat of the transformer. The coil with the covers removed. The tuning coils were actually functional, but I knew they were going to have to be rewired in the chassis. The dial was also in very bad condition, and there was no way that that piece of brass was going to be brought back with its numbers. As you can see, the transformer wires were all corroded and destroyed. There was no way the original wiring was ever going to be used again. The dial face was going to have to be recreated, as nobody makes a decal for that one. As you can see, the board with the bakelite and the screws and the washers were all corroded, and this had been sitting in a barn for a long, long time. With the pictures taken, it stripped the thing apart, start working on it. I knew that the entire chassis was going to have to be rewired, so a lot of hand-drawn diagrams were created before I desoldered all the original wires from the unit. The volume control itself is an unusual, intricate piece that took quite a while to bring back, but it turned out very nice and was well within spec. The chassis I had to have sandblasted in a local auto shop, and as you can see, prior to putting it all back together, it was stunning again. The capacitor cans create their own unique challenge, as you have to replace the capacitors with modern equivalents, even down to replacing the original labels. No one will ever see that label again, probably, but it's nice to know that it's there. The brass tuning bezel was quite the challenge to restore, and it turned out very nice, even down to the fine-tuning walnut knob on the front of the radio, which turned out really great. Once again, the front of the radio was starting to look normal again. Well, here we have the bottom of the chassis. It's all been rewired now. It was an awful long process. Remember how it looked before we started on it with that very gross double ear condenser? Things are looking a lot better now under the chassis. And with the bottom finished, we turned our attention back to the top. A lot of the controls are still being held in place by cardboard at this point. The transformer repainted and back on the unit. All the lettering repainted where the tubes go. All the screws, washers, and little rivets have been polished again. Then on to the tuning dial, which was quite the process. We had to recreate the water slide decal, put it on the brass, and then re-rivet that piece to the wheel. With the condensers all back in place and the tuning ready to go, we did get a perfectly good working set of tubes mounted on the radio, and once again it started to look like a radio chassis. With the radio chassis now completely finished, it was time to turn our attention to the power supply. Well, on to the restoration of the power supply. As always, we started by taking an awful lot of pictures of the unit, so that when we go to put it back together again, we kind of have a guide to go by. As you can see, the underneath side has the same corroded wires as the chassis did. It all has to be replaced. We stripped the unit down, with it all taken apart in pieces. Of course, we had our little hand-drawn schematic of the unit. Then it was on to the capacitor block. Well, it was pretty bad, and we couldn't determine exactly what the capacitance numbers were. So we had to split the unit apart, tear it down, and take a look-see. And after that, as you can see, we have the replacement capacitors sitting on top of the old ones. You can see the new ones are an awful lot smaller. These were then mounted to the blocks, wired, glued into place, so they could be slipped back into the capacitor box. And with the top back on the unit, it looked like nothing ever happened, and we had all the original color codes again. We spent an inordinately large amount of time recreating the wiring harness that runs between the power supply and the radio itself. This took quite a while to get everything lined up right, and we even had to build a jig to make sure that it would come out correctly. Here we have the bottom of the power supply now, all rewired. Of course, we did add a fuse and a couple of safety caps to it to make sure the unit was a little safer than the way it came back in 1928. Well, the power supply is now just about finished, starting to look like a power supply again. All rewired with a correct 80 rectifier sitting in it. We had to create our own custom schematic for the power supply, as we had to do a lot of experimenting with the final voltages it was delivering to the tubes in the radio. After the third revision, we finally got it right, so it was a long drawn out process to get the power supply back to where it needed to be. Well, at this point, we could finally hook everything up together, run some power to the unit, and begin all the testing. The testing went on for quite a long time before one afternoon I had finished the testing and I was happy with my results, and I started playing with the tuning knob before I turned it off, and a baseball game started playing through the speaker. It was a very emotional moment, as this was the first time in probably 60 years that this radio had played again. We knew we finally had it right, and it was time to put it all back together in the cabinet. Well, with everything now going back into the cabinet and the bolts in place, it's time to take a look back at what we started with. Well, we had come a long way since that point. I love a good before and after. It really started to look like a great radio again, and with everything back in the cabinet, it was time that we called an end to this restoration.
Thanks for sitting through the long slideshow. Over 1,000 pictures were taken of this radio before, during, and after the restoration. There's no way to see them all. It was a lot of fun. We're going to crank it up again and let it play another song. Then we're going to shut her down and save those tubes for another day. Thanks for stopping by. Save those tubes for another day.